Greetings and welcome to Logic 2.1. Today we're going to be talking about formal versus informal fallacies. Essentially, the idea is a fallacy is an error in reasoning that essentially just makes the argument appear stronger or makes it appear valid when it is not. Now, a fallacy comes from a Latin word which means to deceive or to dupe. And so essentially a fallacy is just an attempt to deceive or dupe a person. Sometimes it is done by a person trying to argue. And so they will give information and try to fool you. And so they're trying to deceive you into believing their conclusion. And sometimes it's done to oneself. Sometimes one simply is so convinced that they want to prove what they want to prove that they don't bother to pay attention, and they accept evidence they shouldn't, they accept other things. And so fallacies are not necessarily even intentional, they're sometimes done to oneself. And usually what's happening is one is concerned with reaching the conclusion rather than the truth. And logic and philosophy is concerned with reaching the truth, not with reaching conclusions. Now, there's a difference between what we call formal fallacies and informal fallacies. We're going to study informal fallacies. But a formal fallacy is essentially a fallacy that comes in a form. They only occur in deductive arguments, and they deal with problems of the structure of the argument, or the inferential claim. We're going to sort of evaluate, we're going to learn some T's, but when we do truth tables of how we can figure out that fairly simply. But essentially, a formal fallacy is when you say, hey, that's not valid, it's invalid. And it deals with the form, that's why it's formal. Example is when you like, all wines are drinks, all wines are alcoholic, therefore all drinks are alcoholic. Sometimes if you see this, and this one's pretty clear that the conclusion isn't true and the premises are, but sometimes you get one of these that it's not. And what happens is just because all wines are drinks and all wines are alcoholic doesn't mean that all drinks fall within the greater category of alcoholic. So that's a formal problem. It's the way it's set up. It appears to be valid, but it's not. Informal fallacies, on the other hand, occur only in inductive arguments. And they're not just about form, but they're about the content. So you have to kind of evaluate it. And it's sort of how you say strong or weak, but there are various ways in which an argument can be poorly formed. Or not poorly formed, but informally fallacious. We have various categories. The first, chapter 2.2, will deal with relevance, fallacies of relevance. Essentially those say they introduce irrelevant information. Fallacies of weak induction, essentially those are arguments that they appear as if they have good reasons, but in fact the induction or the reasons are weak. They actually are relevant, they're just weak, and they may appear strong, but they're not. Fallacies of presumption. The fallacy of presumption is where essentially one's already assumed the conclusion within the premises, and so the premises support the conclusion also supports the premises. It's sort of a circular way of going about it, that the assumption or the conclusion has already been presumed, and so it's worked into the premises, but then the premises might also be dependent upon the conclusion. So it's sort of a weird mix, but essentially it depends upon the presumption the conclusion is true, and so you've worked that conclusion in already. Ambiguity. Ambiguity just turns on language being unclear, or either terms or statements. And grammatical analogy is essentially a problem with moving from wholes to parts and parts to wholes. And it's essentially trying to use an analogy that because something's true of the parts, it's true of the whole, or because something's true of the whole, it's true of the parts. We'll talk more about those later. Alright, so that's basically all there is to the formal versus informal. It's fairly simple. Formal deal with deductive, and informal are problems within it. So let's move straight on to relevance in chapter 2.2. Thank you.